For weeks, much of the public conversation assumed a single masked figure. One person, one intruder, one offender. That assumption may be wrong. The biological evidence recovered from this case does not point to one contributor. It points to two. This is not commentary. It is laboratory output. Two distinct DNA profiles recovered from two locations tied to the same abduction, and they do not match each other. If that holds, this is no longer a lone actor investigation. And if two people were involved, this was not isolation. It was coordination. Coordination increases the chance that someone talks, because shared crimes create shared liability. And shared liability rarely holds perfectly under pressure. At the same time, the Guthrie family placed $1 million in public circulation, not a gesture, a mechanism aimed not at the suspect. They cannot be bought, but at every person in their orbit who has been running a private calculation about what they know and what silence costs. At $1 million, that calculation is no longer stable for most people holding it. The science is moving. The money is applying pressure. Taken together, this may be the first real leverage in this case. So let's look at what that actually means. Because if two people were involved, and if $1 million is now in circulation, then something inside the structure has already shifted. Every framework for interpreting two non-matching profiles leads toward identification. The suspect cannot choose which framework is true. They can only wait to find out which one has already started closing around them. The geography of the evidence matters before anything else, because where each profile was recovered defines the investigative question each one is answering. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills, investigators collected biological material that did not belong to her or to anyone in her family. The family was tested, the family was cleared. The material was submitted to CODIS, the National Criminal Database holding profiles from individuals previously arrested or convicted across the United States. CODIS searched, CODIS returned nothing. The contributor has no prior record in that system. Separately, a pair of gloves was recovered approximately 2 miles from the home. Those gloves match the ones worn by the masked figure captured on the doorbell camera before Nancy's disappearance. Investigators confirmed the match. The gloves contain DNA. That DNA was tested, the profile generated was placed alongside the profile from inside the home. They do not align, different contributors. Different biological sources, both connected to the same event, neither in CODIS. Two profiles, two locations. One investigation that now has more biological evidence than it did before, pointing in more directions than a single profile would allow. The precision required here, non-matching profiles do not automatically establish two perpetrators. The forensic record is not yet capable of that inference. And committing to a wrong model before the evidence forces it is how an investigation misallocates resources at the moment it can least afford to. What the non-match establishes is exact and important biological material from two different contributors was recovered from two locations tied to this case, and both contributors sit outside the CODIS system. That is the established fact. Everything downstream of it is interpretive framework, and the frameworks matter because each one points investigators in a specific direction with specific tools. The forensic record has produced more information than a single profile result would have. The question it now demands, what do two profiles mean, has three possible answers. Every one of them leads somewhere actionable. Call this the breaking point. The threshold at which the two-profile result stops being a forensic anomaly and becomes a structural map of what this case is. The first framework, a single actor, two contact events. One person was inside the home. That same person, at a different point in the operation, handled or wore the gloves. A contamination variable or a collection artifact produced apparent differentiation between two samples that originate with one contributor. This framework preserves a lone actor model and does not require a second person, only a forensic explanation for the divergence between profiles. If this framework is correct, the genealogy search on either profile eventually converges on the same biological network. Two paths, one destination. The non-match becomes a procedural complication that the genealogy result dissolves on its own. The second framework, two actors, two roles. The home profile belongs to the individual present for the 41 minutes documented in the footage. The glove profile belongs to a second person, someone who handled the gloves, transported them, or disposed of them at a separate point in the operation. Two people, two biological signatures. Define roles in a coordinated effort. If this framework is correct, the investigation is not looking for one person. It is looking for a structure. The Pima County Sheriff has already publicly declined to rule out an accomplice not as a statement of confusion, but as an investigative posture held by people who have seen the two-profile result and have not been able to eliminate it. If two actors are involved, the genealogy searches run against each profile toward different family trees, different names, and potentially two separate warrants. The third framework, secondary transfer. Biological material does not move only through direct contact. It moves through intermediate objects, shared surfaces, shared environments. Someone whose profile appears on the gloves may have had no operational role in what happened to Nancy Guthrie. They may share a living space, a vehicle, or a daily environment with the actual suspect. Their DNA reached those gloves through proximity, and proximity, traced backward, leads directly into the suspect's immediate world. This is the framework that appears most complicated and proves most useful. Because if the second profile originated through secondary transfer, the genealogy search run against it does not lead to an unrelated stranger. It leads into the suspect's domestic or social orbit, a household, a workplace, a regular environment. It surfaces someone who knows the suspect, who has likely watched the coverage, and who is now sitting inside the pressure field created by $1 million without fully understanding that their DNA is already in a processing pipeline pointed at the person next to them. There is a further structural implication of secondary transfer that public coverage has not examined. When the genealogy search on the secondary profile returns a familial candidate, investigators cross-reference that candidate against the genealogy candidate generated by the primary profile. If both candidates exist within the same immediate social environment, share a household, a workplace, a regular point of contact with the suspect, the secondary transfer interpretation is confirmed, and the lead sharpens into the suspect's domestic world. If the candidates are biologically unrelated and geographically separated, secondary transfer weakens as an explanation, and the dual actor model gains structural weight. The forensic science is not generating isolated results in this case. It is generating a matrix, and each new result recalibrates the evidentiary weight of every result already in the record. That matrix has a specific investigative value that goes beyond the individual profiles. It functions as a consistency test for whatever narrative the eventual suspect offers. If the genealogy results converge on a single environment, and the purchase trail connects that environment to the gear in the footage, and the tip line cross-references surface the same name, the suspect's available defenses narrow dramatically before they have been charged with anything. The evidence does not wait for an arrest to begin building the case. It is building it now, across every active track, in a form that will be very difficult to explain from the other side of a courtroom. None of these frameworks allow the evidence to stay where it is. Each one is in motion. And the motion is not random, it is directional, pointed at a person who has not yet been named, but who left a biological record at two locations that investigators are now working from both ends. The suspect cannot choose which framework is true. What they can be certain of is that investigators are running resources against all three simultaneously, and that each one, if confirmed, moves directly toward a name. The genealogy pathway operates on logic that is structurally unlike anything else in this investigation, and understanding it is essential to understanding why two CODIS failures are not setbacks. They are redirects toward a tool with no equivalent ceiling. CODIS works from a prior record. If you are in the system, a match returns your identity. If you are not, it returns nothing. That boundary is fixed. Both profiles in this case have already reached it. Genetic genealogy does not search for the contributor. It searches for anyone who shares enough biological material with the contributor to represent a familial connection, a parent, a sibling, a first or second cousin, and it finds them in voluntary ancestry databases built by people who had no investigative intent. They submitted their DNA out of curiosity about their origins. They did not know they were creating a biological access point that, under the right forensic conditions, reaches any relative who shares enough of their genetic signature. The suspect cannot intercept that trail. They have no mechanism to reach the cousin who uploaded their profile to an ancestry database 5 years ago in a different state. They cannot query those databases for their own family's exposure. They can identify which relative, if any, has already created the partial match that a genealogy team is working backward from right now. The search moves through a population the suspect cannot monitor, toward a connection they did not create and have no ability to sever. That is not a theoretical asymmetry. It is the operational condition of this investigation. Now apply the two-profile structure to it directly. If both profiles enter genealogy processing, and the forensic architecture of this case makes that the logical next step for both investigators are running two simultaneous biological searches, two separate signals moving outward through two separate family trees, each one hunting for a partial match that can be worked backward to a living candidate. If both return candidates who converge on the same person, investigators have produced biological confirmation of a single actor model from two independent evidentiary sources. That is not just a lead. That is the structural foundation of a prosecution. If both return candidates who do not converge two separate individuals, two separate biological networks, the dual actor interpretation receives forensic support. Two names, two separate investigative tracks, two warrants. If one search returns a candidate and the other has not yet, investigators pursue the live thread while the second search continues. That search does not close. It waits. The databases that feed it grow every week, independent of any investigative action, because people continue to upload their DNA for reasons that have nothing to do with this case. The probability of a usable partial match increases on its own schedule. This is what makes genetic genealogy different from every other method currently deployed. It does not stall. It does not negotiate. It requires no witness to overcome fear and no informant to recalculate loyalty. It requires only that a biological relative exists somewhere in a growing database, and those databases are not waiting for this investigation to catch up. The suspect's biological network is not under their control. It never was. And investigators are already inside it. Now, the $1 million. Not as context, as mechanism. The family of Nancy Guthrie has offered up to $1 million for her safe return. The FBI has offered $100,000 separately. The figure in circulation is $1 million. Every person in Tucson, with any proximity to this suspect, has processed that number. A reward of this size does not operate the way most people assume. It is not aimed at uninvolved bystanders. It is aimed at a specific and finite category of person, someone who has meaningful knowledge, has been deciding what to do with it, and has not yet made a call. That person is not passive. They're actively managing a calculation, weighing what they know against what disclosure costs, what silence costs, and how stable either position remains over time. At $1 million, silence becomes structurally unstable for most people in that position. Not because the money alone is sufficient motivation, but because the number shifts every other variable in the calculation. It raises the social cost of staying quiet. It raises the moral weight of the decision. And it introduces a specific pressure that operates independently of everything else. The awareness that someone else in the same orbit, with the same knowledge, may be running the same calculation and resolve it differently. The race is not only against the suspect's exposure, it is against everyone else who knows anything and is now asking themselves whether they want to be second. That dynamic, the fear of being the person who waited while someone else made the call, is one of the most reliable behavioral levers that a public reward at this threshold generates. It does not require the person to be altruistic. It does not require them to feel certain. It requires them to recognize that their window of maximum leverage is not permanent. The suspect prepared for cameras. They disabled a doorbell. They wore a mask and gloves. They did not prepare for the specific atmospheric shift that occurs when $1 million enters the social environment of everyone who knows them. Silence at $1 million is not a stable position. For the person holding the most useful knowledge in this investigation, the window for maximum value is already narrowing. Consider what the suspect knows right now against what they cannot know. They know a vehicle was seized under federal warrant. They know biological material was recovered from inside the home. They know the gloves were found. They know the reward is $1 million. They know investigators have been circulating photographs through gun shops across Tucson. They have seen the same coverage as everyone else. What they cannot know, whether the genealogy search has returned a familial candidate, what laboratory processing of the seized vehicle has produced, which of the people closest to them has begun to recalculate, how far the purchase trail has traveled toward a transaction with their name attached. That gap between the public surface of the investigation and what is running privately is not a comfort. It is the most corrosive condition the suspect faces. They cannot resolve it through any available action. They cannot call the FBI lab. They cannot query the ancestry databases for their own family's exposure. They cannot know what is happening in the mind of the person nearest to them who has been watching the coverage and doing arithmetic. People in that condition do not hold perfectly still. They seek information in ways that can be detected. They make contact with individuals connected to the evidence. They revisit locations that carry significance. They alter communication patterns in ways that register to investigators monitoring key locations and digital signals across Tucson. The behavioral signature of a suspect under sustained invisible pressure is not invisible to a prepared investigative team. There is a specific pattern that investigators in active abduction cases watch for: the suspect who overcorrects, who goes conspicuously quiet on platforms where they were previously active, who distances themselves from people they used to contact regularly, who begins making decisions designed to reduce exposure, but which, by their specificity and timing, draw the kind of attention that normal behavior would not. Silence can be as readable as noise when it arrives at exactly the moment investigators begin looking. A person who knows what happened in that home, who has been watching the same coverage as everyone else, and who is now managing their own behavior in response to that coverage, is managing behavior in a way that investigators monitoring the case from multiple angles are specifically trained to identify. The suspect improvised once on the porch when a camera they had not anticipated required an immediate response. They pulled foliage from the ground to block the lens. That decision was captured permanently. It tells investigators something direct. Under real-time pressure, this person reacts in ways that leave a record. They do not disappear. They adapt visibly. An adaptation under sustained, invisible investigative pressure over weeks is a fundamentally different cognitive task than a single porch-level improvisation, one that has a documented track record of producing the first actionable lead in cases structured exactly like this one. The suspect's uncertainty about which thread is closest is itself a pressure system. And pressure, sustained long enough against someone who already makes visible mistakes, produces movement that investigators are specifically positioned to see. If a second person was involved, the structural calculus shifts further. In a lone actor scenario, the suspect's silence is self-contained. They manage it alone. The forensic pathway genealogy, purchase records, vehicle processing works against one person's private discipline, and that is a known investigative challenge with known tools. In a dual actor scenario, silence becomes a shared liability with an unequal distribution. Two people exposed to the same investigative pressure carry different risk profiles, different investments in the outcome, and different responses to $1 million moving through their social world. The suspect may be disciplined. They spent months preparing. They built psychological insulation around their role before the operation began. Their associate did not necessarily prepare to the same depth, hold to the same degree, or anticipate the specific legal exposure they now occupy. That asymmetry is precise and exploitable. A secondary actor who handled the gloves, managed logistics, or performed any supporting function did not spend months steeling themselves for a federal investigation. They are watching the same coverage, hearing the same $1 million figure, and understanding for the first time with real clarity what a federal conspiracy charge looks like against what cooperation looks like. Those are not equivalent outcomes. The Pima County Sheriff's refusal to publicly close the accomplice question is not indecision disclosed accidentally. It is a message delivered deliberately, directed not at the general public, but at a secondary actor who may be watching, calculating, and deciding whether loyalty to the primary suspect is still the position that serves them best. The investigation does not need both people to break. It needs one. And the one most likely to reach that threshold first is the person who prepared the least, invested the least, and now stands fully exposed to the same forensic machinery as the person who planned this for months. One call ends this. The person most likely to make it is the one who least expected to be in the position of deciding. The science and the money do not operate in parallel without interacting. Each one changes what the other can produce. And the combination generates pressure that neither creates independently. If the genealogy search returns a candidate before any reward disclosure arrives, investigators approach that candidate with biological evidence already in hand. The candidate cannot credibly deny the connection to the evidence their familial link is documentable and specific. The conversation that follows begins from forensic certainty, not from suspicion that the candidate can simply decline to engage with. That is a categorically different investigative position than approaching someone on the basis of a tip alone, where the subject can claim the tip is mistaken, biased, or fabricated. Biological evidence has no equivalent credibility problem. If a reward disclosure arrives before the genealogy search completes, investigators take that name and run it against every active data stream, the purchase trail, existing tip line cross-references, digital signals, geographic indicators tied to key dates and locations. A name that arrives through the human network and then survives cross-reference against the forensic record does not remain a tip. It becomes the structural core of a probable cause affidavit. The human source created the lead. The forensic cross-reference built the evidentiary foundation around it. Those are not redundant steps. They are a progression from suspicion to action. If both arrive at the same name, a genealogy candidate who also appears in a disclosure from within the suspect's orbit, investigators are at convergence. Two independent pathways, operating on entirely separate logic, reaching the same person. That is not a theory that requires further development. That is a warrant. And it is a warrant that arrives with evidentiary support from two directions, which is the strongest possible position from which to execute it. The reward does not compete with the science. It accelerates where the science is pointed. The science does not wait for the reward. It runs on its own schedule, regardless of what the human network does. When they meet at the same address, the narrowing phase ends and the next phase begins immediately, without delay and without negotiation. 20,000 tips have reached investigators. Within that volume, specific individuals were named. Those names are being cross-referenced against purchase records and surveillance data. Somewhere in that volume, the most useful disclosure in this investigation may already exist, waiting for cross-reference to identify it. The masked figure in the doorbell footage, male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches, medium build, Ozark Trail backpack from Walmart, a revolver-style holster used to carry a semi-automatic pistol it was never designed for, is not a construction. That is a person who exists within the ordinary retail and residential geography of Tucson. Someone with neighbors, someone with a social environment, someone who left biological material at 2 locations connected to this crime and has not yet been named. The purchase trail, the genealogy searches, and the reward-driven recalculations happening right now in a finite number of minds are not running in sequence. They are running simultaneously, each one moving independently, each one capable of producing the name that makes the others irrelevant. When any one of them arrives, the investigation does not slow down to reassess. It shifts from narrowing to concluding. Here is where this case stands. 2 DNA profiles, 2 locations, 2 contributors, neither in CODIS, both candidates for genealogy processing that does not require the suspect's cooperation, does not require their prior record, and cannot be intercepted through any action available to them. 3 interpretive frameworks, each one an active investigative direction, none of them a dead end. $1 million in public circulation running through a finite human network surrounding the suspect, destabilizing the silence of every person in that network who is holding partial knowledge and has been managing a cost-benefit calculation that no longer pencils out the same way it did before that number appeared. A seized vehicle in forensic processing, a purchase trail with a dedicated team, a pacemaker signal sniffer deployed across Tucson, 20,000 tips cross-referenced against every active data stream. The forensic uncertainty that remains, which framework is correct, which genealogy search returns first, which thread arrives at a name before the others, does not reflect an investigation without direction. It reflects an investigation that has not yet declared its result. Those are not the same condition. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She requires daily medication. The investigation running on her behalf has direction, active tools, and multiple independent pathways closing toward the same point. The only remaining question is structural. Which pathway reaches a name first? The genealogy search moving through a biological network the suspect cannot see, or the recalculation now running in the mind of someone who knows enough to end this and is no longer certain that silence is the position that serves them best. Those pathways do not arrive gradually. They produce a threshold event, one moment at which a specific name becomes actionable and the investigation shifts from narrowing to concluding without warning. The suspect does not know which thread is closest. They do not know that both are already in motion. This is unresolved.